This is the setting for the fourth oral history interview to be conducted on August 8th, 1980 in the Tidwell Bible Building, room B23. The interview will be between Dr. Daniel B. McGee, interviewer, and Reverend M.L. Cooper, Jr., interviewee. The interview will be a part of the Religion and Culture Project of the Baylor University Program for Oral History.
This is our fourth interview with Reverend M.L. Cooper, who is pastor of the Second Baptist Church here in Waco. Our interview is taking place on August the 8th, 1980, a Friday morning. My name is Dan McGee. I'm professor of religion at Baylor, and our interview is taking place in the history seminar room in Tidwell Building. That's in the basement of Tidwell Building on the Baylor University campus. Reverend Cooper, thank you again for giving us some time out of a very busy pastor's schedule. We were discussing last time the period in your life in the late 50s when you moved from Austin to Waco to become pastor of the Second Baptist Church. Let's talk about the history of the Second Baptist Church. It celebrated its centennial last year, 1979. And as is true of any institution, I'm sure there's stories about its past. You mentioned in our interview yesterday, one thing, you described briefly how it began as a group that had been going to New Hope, I gather, formed a church in this part of town. You said that the difficulty in bad weather made it difficult for them to get all the way up to New Hope. Were there any other factors in the group's forming a church in this part of town and separating itself from New Hope?
I think that would be the predominant factor, the struggles of trying to get across the ditches and rivulets when it did rain, and struggles going through the mud,
Right.
and the distance that they had to travel. So this is, by and large, decided we ought to have organized a church in our neighborhood where we can attend without any great hazards.
Right. Well, who were the founding fathers and mothers of the Second Baptist Church?
I've read the history, but I guess trying to make some history myself, I have not just zeroed in on trying to remember the
Right.
names of these individuals. It was a small group, and
How large was the group? Do you recall? Was it
I
a
don't
dozen
think-
or?
I would say somewhere in that number.
Were they assisted by any other churches in town that you know about?
Other than the getting on foot, where a church has to go through certain procedures to become sort of recognized as organized. But other than that, they started in their own meager way and continued to move along.
Well, who were some of the better-known pastors of Second Baptist Church during its history before you came?
Right. All right. During the early period of Second Baptist history, you had a Reverend Montgomery. I don't know personally too much about him, but he seemed to have been a strong pastor in terms of the church history.
Mm-hmm. Was he there for a good period of time?
He was there just a short time.
I see.
In fact, I may mention I'm the 18th pastor
Mm-hmm.
within the 100 years. Some of those years, you had pastors that stayed 2 years.
Yes.
Looking at the history, you have several things involved. When you look at the turnover of pastors, I know a number of churches can boast of, within their 100 years, some 3 pastors, or 4, or 5, but 18 is a pretty good number.
Yes.
I have been there 23 years, which leaves me with the record in terms of tenure. I succeeded the Reverend George J. Johnson, who was there 17 years, and of course he was the record bearer until his death. He heart condition, heart trouble. So it seems the last 2 pastors have put in their 2 times together, put in a little less than half less than 50% of the history. I guess a number of things would point to a turnover. Those are doing some lean years, and you had maybe struggle of power on both sides. Had some pretty strong laymen, as I understand, in the church, and certainly you had some pastors who, because of personalities, temperaments, could only maybe maintain pastorate there or anywhere else for limited length of time. We do have another pastor that fitted into the history of in a strong way. In fact, some of his evidence of pastoring is there now. The present building was built by the Reverend A.A. Lucas, who was there a short time, and by and large, his leaving Second Baptist was because of the Depression. It was after the incident of the lynching, and with the Depression also, a number of people left Waco, as I understand, and those who stayed didn't have much money to keep things going, and it looms to peak there in the history of Second Baptist, because there was a period after his leaving that they thought their doors may be locked any day.
Because of finances.
Because of finance. Even to the extent that even the church went on auction, was auctioned off. At least it reached the auction period. And a neighbor, black, who was not a member of the church, he has relatives in that church and certainly in this vicinity, made a bid, and he was somewhat wealthy, and he gave the church opportunity to pay him as they saw fit.
Do you remember what year that was approximately?
Just offhand, these dates slipped me.
Do you remember the name of this person?
Graves was his last name.
Graves.
Yes.
All right. Any other pastors of some note that are remembered in the history of Second Baptist?
I named Montgomery, did I?
That's right.
Yes.
And Lucas.
And Lucas. That could be. I believe those,
All right.
some of the others were fine pastors, but some were sort of came through Waco as a as a stepping stone to another
Right.
place, so
All right.
didn't have a chance.
Well, you mentioned some things there that I'd like for us to pursue so that people will kind of understand how churches work. They are like all other institutions. They have their struggles and difficulties. You mentioned that sometimes there's conflict between pastor and strong layman in the church. What is the nature of the way the power is divided in the Black Baptist churches that you are familiar with? That is, how does their organization structured and how does it function? Who's really in charge? Who calls the shots?
All right, I think one thing we would need to look at, and that is where we've come from,
All right.
by and large, in church life. Years ago, the churches had what we call part-time services. They met once a month or twice a month. Some to name first Sunday and the third, or the second and the fourth. These churches were more or less kind of scattered through the countryside, small communities, and they felt they couldn't afford to pay a pastor for the full time.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing in the picture is that this pastor came from some distance. He had to travel 20 to 30 to 50 miles or more, give a little, take a little.
Mm-hmm.
He traveled by train, which was the main transportation, or some came by horse and buggy during the earlier period, where it was maybe more convenient than going from station to station, or somebody would pick him up at the station that was convenient. So with the part-time church service, the head deacon, as it is referred to sometimes, the chairman of the deacon board, somebody else, some layman was left in charge, and the pastor would say, "You keep everything, you in charge until I get back." Well, this became a part of the church program. Those who grew up under it, they looked
Sure.
to the head deacon, the chairman of the deacon board, or they looked to the layman who was in charge until the pastor got back, and they saw him more than they saw the pastor.
That's right. That's right.
So here was one given that authority, and here were those who grew up under that kind of leadership.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, as church life moved along, as it progressed, you had churches saying that we ought to meet more than just twice a month, and we ought to become full-time. Sometimes it would come from one side, sometimes it would come suggestion-wise from some of the pastors.
Mm-hmm.
And little by little, churches became more full-time because they discovered they needed this spiritual regularity more, and then they discovered that they could cover the budget that was necessary. And so then, moving full-time, the pastor many times would be moved on the scene to live in the parsonage, to church paid what was necessary for him to live in town, live in that town. But you had this other inherited type of procedure. And from time to time, I guess a number of our churches where people have moved in from the small communities, they still come with that type of system in their minds, and they will go to the deacon, go to that lead personality before they go to the pastor. And of course, some individuals enjoy that type of position. And many times, if he's not careful, or if others not careful, he's shoved in a way to take over, take charge.
Well, that's a very clear and reasonable explanation for this conflict.
Right.
Because it would be very natural then for those who had been accustomed to providing leadership to continue.
Right.
Even after you have a full-time pastor.
Right. He's enjoyed that position.
All right. Before we leave the history of Second Baptist Church up until your coming, looking at its past, any important events that stand out? Now, you mentioned the building of the church, the present church building. Any others? Let's talk a little bit about the oral tradition about the lynching here in Waco, and the impact of that upon the black community, and especially upon church members. What are the stories? Tell us the story as it has been remembered in the black community.
I guess growing up in a segregated society, this was one incident. It happened in Waco, but it happened so many places. And of course, they knew these things would happen. They knew many times innocent individuals were lynched. Yes, somebody said that, some woman said that he raped me, and that was all that had to be said. No investigation. So it was, I'm saying that to say that it was fairly practiced through the South every now and then to lynch. I have not maybe dug into it to see, as maybe the question is raised now, but I have heard some of the laymen now who are youngsters in just say what a horror it was, and maybe what distress it brought to them during those early periods.
Well, of course, you're not able to document it and all,
Right.
but what is the story that they tell? I think it's worthwhile, whether we can document every detail or not, it's worthwhile to know the story as people remember it.
Right.
And what do they remember? How do they tell the story about how it happened? What happened as they recall the story?
I could go back and check this out a little nearer, but it appears, as I recall now, so much water here again, I say, runs over the dam, and you're involved and you're part of this thrust until you sort of shove these things, and maybe when you get back to it. But as I recall, this was the man who was lynched was innocent. And I think, as I recall, he again, best of my knowledge, he was somewhat retarded, if I'm not mistaken. So there were two areas where it was hard for them in the midst of.
I'm trying to remember the approximate date of this. Was this in the 30s, late
I
30s?
would sure have to go back
Yeah,
and
well, I
check
can't
it
recall
out.
either, but I've heard the story,
Right.
and it certainly had a tremendous impact upon the entire community. I think especially the blacks in the community. You indicated that there's at least the story that some blacks may have left Waco because of that.
That is correct.
Is that sentiment, is that feeling pretty widespread in the black community? That is, that's kind of what they remember. A lot of people were so threatened by this that they just left Waco.
I guess I remember this incident in the overall picture because of a statement that was made, a conversation between Dr. Jenkins, who was at New Hope for some 40 years or more, and the A.A. Lucas, who built Second Baptist. They were conferring together, and Dr. Jenkins kind of told Reverend Lucas that he wouldn't build too large a structure because of the people who had left.
Hmm.
And of course, Reverend Lucas, you would have to know him to really hear him say that I'm not building it for the folk who left, I'm building it for the folk who are here. And speaking of the folk who had left, to speak more or less of those people who left during that lynch incident.
All right. One other thing about the history of Second Baptist, as you indicated, lay people were important as well as pastors.
Right.
Are there any, I'm sure there are many outstanding members who contributed through the 100 years of his history, but who are the lay people whose names tend to be remembered most frequently, who have been leaders in Second Baptist and who have contributed to it? Not just in financial ways, but you know, sometimes I know some churches it'll be a little old lady who's who's taught the children for 50 years, who may be remembered in years later as the person that most people knew or remembered. Do you recall any such layman in the history of Second Baptist?
You have one that I think of, and that's lawyer. I couldn't call that name now.
Well, you can put that in later.
Yes, I'll come back to it. Understood he sort of led in some of the lawsuits, like lawyer.
This was in the period of the 50s?
This would be back in the 40s.
40s?
Yes, and 30, yes, somewhere in the 30, 40.
Was he a lawyer here in Waco?
Right.
Well, it's been my experience that there are not many black lawyers in
That's right.
Waco.
That's right. This is correct. So he was killed by a train wreck going from church.
About what time, what year did that occur, do you recall?
I couldn't recall.
Okay.
I'm not good at remembering dates
I'm not either.
other than special dates of some things that happened to me.
Yes.
And I forget none of them if I'm not careful.
Right. Well, any others?
There's another one, but I guess for the moment the federal project is named after her.
Kane?
Over, not Cane Home, but the one in East Waco.
I don't know. We can put that in later.
Right, we can get
All
that.
right. Was this a woman?
Right. She was quite popular with the church. She was kind of a musician, music writer. She was
Mhm.
kind of popular with the community, Waco community. In fact, this federal project is named after her. I should be able to call it, but
Well, we'll get that
Uh-huh.
later. All right. Any other people or events that you recall that stand out in the history of Second Baptist?
I would think these are the uppermost.
All right.
Mm-hmm. As I maybe stated yesterday, the church has had these several pastors that I've named. They have been leaders in the state and in the nation. Reverend Lucas was president when he died here some 12, 15 years ago. He was president of the state convention, and he was treasurer of the National Baptist Convention of America.
All right. Let's look at the associations that Second Baptist Church had with other churches when you came here in the late 50s.
Mm-hmm.
Describe the other black Baptist churches in town and their pastors and the kinds of associations and relationships that existed among them.
Mm-hmm. All right. You have had, maybe for a number of years, the pastors coming together, pastors of the various churches and ministers, not whether they're pastor or not, uniting as an association, Baptist, named Baptist Ministers Union, Waco and McLennan County. This sort of brings about a fellowship. The pastors, the pastor of Second Baptist would be sort of looked upon because of Second Baptist being maybe the size membership, people maybe coming from across. The pastor would be looked upon as one who would give some kind of leadership to the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
I guess a part of it is because of its size, the others because of maybe some precedents that have been set by some of the pastors. This would be what they would hope. The pastor of Second Baptist, or the pastors of Second Baptist, and I'm looking at one or two, the names will always surface. E.J. Johnson, not E.J. Johnson, but George Johnson, whom I succeeded. He was associated closely with the Reverend Hegman, who was pastor of Tolliver's Chapel Baptist Church. He was associated with Reverend Bailey, who is pastor of Antioch Baptist Church. I'm talking about their relationship now. And of course, here again, it varies. Each man sort of picks his friends. And sometimes one coming in, he inherits this. And of course, whether he wants to disinherit, that's left with him. Our coming to Waco, Reverend Hegman was pastor of Tolliver's Chapel, and we struck up fellowship together. Maybe Hardy had not, he had been here some number of years before I came, but it seems that we became closer associates, and the former pastor at Second Baptist.
Now, Hardee was pastor of
First Baptist.
First Baptist Church.
Mhm. So he and I got to be maybe closer than as two individuals than a number of the other pastors that we were part of in fellowship. We made several trips to some meetings together. We have had fellowship with Antioch. Now, some of these pastors, we sort of know that we are on the same level somewhat in leadership. And what we do, I don't know how widely it's practiced maybe with other denominations, but we exchange fellowships. He may come, I may invite the pastor of Tolliver's Chapel to come and with his choir, with his members, to preach the church anniversary. In fact, this coming Sunday, I'm to be at Tolliver's Chapel in their anniversary service. And then our churches do recognize the pastor one day or week of anniversary. I've chosen more or less just the one day. Whatever encouragement, words, and other gifts. We may have one of the pastors local to come in and preach, or we may invite one from out of town to come with his choir and the membership, as many as will come. So you've had this kind of fellowship. I've had fellowship with Reverend Hansborough, who is pastor of the Mount Carmel Baptist Church. In fact, he served as president of our Baptist Ministers Union up until about 5 years ago. I served as his vice when he retired. When he retired from the presidency, they moved me up to that position. This, in a short way, I guess, would point out the kind of fellowship.
Let's, then you've named 4 churches here other than the Second Baptist Church, Tolliver's Chapel, Antioch, First Baptist, Mount Carmel.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk briefly about those churches and any distinctions that they may have as churches. You know, different churches in different parts of the community sometimes serve different purposes, maybe have different kind of membership, they have different size membership, they play a different function. Which are the well, let's start with one thing. It's not necessarily the most important, but in terms of size of membership, which is the larger one or two of the?
Tolliver's Chapel would be the largest.
All right, in terms of membership.
Membership.
All right. What would be second and third largest approximately?
I would say New Hope and Second Baptist are running pretty close.
All right.
There may be some little variation from maybe a few years here and a few years there. Antioch would fit into that category somewhere.
Right.
First Baptist, all these are kind of your lead. Now, even though I named these, there are others that we do have some fellowship with, if no more than the pastors. We stay in touch with them, even though we can't carry out choirs and members everywhere. There's one church I hope to be with tonight as pastors, representative, carry greetings from the church.
Well, let's talk about other things regarding this church. For example, I remember several years ago someone describing Second Baptist Church to me. And they said, and I don't know, I hadn't thought about this until now. Someone said, Well, Second Baptist is the black church in town that has soul.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Uh-huh.
And they were contrasting it with some others that might have other emphases.
Right.
But they said Second Baptist has soul.
Mm-hmm.
What do they mean by that? And is that accurate?
Well, I think this is maybe a type of description that is given. Lay folk, it's kind of amusing when we hear these descriptions because New Hope, you have a number of teachers, or maybe more teachers there. You have teachers in we have them at Second Baptist. But many times they refer to it as a silk stocking church here.
Yeah.
And then Tolliver's Chapel is a mass church.
Mm-hmm.
And you may have the more amen, praise the Lord, type of, you can just start out and
They'll join you.
they'll join you
Right.
immediately. And Second Baptist, sometimes you may hear amen, sometimes you may not. But they're listening, good listeners. And of course, New Hope sort of leads the line in terms of maybe having a pastor there longer than any other church. Plus, he was a front runner academically. He was trained into some seminary.
You're speaking now.
Dr. Jenkins.
Dr. Jenkins.
Right.
Right.
So, with Dr. Jenkins and with the teachers there, well, to look at its history real quick, J.J. Wilson was the last principal up at the old Moore High School. Well, he succeeded his dad, and all of them were members of New Hope. Well, a number of people coming in to get jobs. Well, some have said they had to join New Hope. I mean, so all these are little things. Some of it's true and some of it's not.
Yeah.
Some people would join to get a job, and others maybe they did have to kind of come on there and identify themselves. But we can understand that some of these procedures can. So this is how, when you see these churches being characterized.
Yeah.
So,
What do you mean by, what does the term silk stocking mean? Does that mean with a little bit of money, or does that mean kind of intellectual, or is it a combination of those?
Combination.
It's a combination of those two.
You had, well, first of all, you had your teachers there, which meant that during maybe when that type of expression came out, your teachers, well, your professionals have more or less always been at the head of the line economically. Your teachers, you had Dr. Radford there. You have Dr. Radford there now, Dr. Mays.
Those are two dentists.
Those two dentists.
Right.
Then you had a Dr. Adams. I believe he passed since I've been in Waco. He was a medical doctor, general practitioner. He was a member there. So you had some of the front runners in economical.
So there's a phrase I've heard used, what is it? Blue veined. Have you ever heard that phrase?
Yes.
What is that? What is? Someone I've heard use that phrase in reference to New Hope. They said New Hope was the blue veined church.
Yeah. Well,
What do they mean?
This speaks of color, your intellect. I mean, your silk stocking would kind of include those who are at the top of the economical strata of society, and the blue vein would be more or less where your light complexion, the people congregate. you may have more there than you have some other church. Because all of these sort of statements, they're kind of mixture. It may not be any more there,
Yes.
blue vein, the light complexioned, than you have at Tolliver's Chapel or at Second Baptist.
Yes.
But
It gets the reputation.
right, it
Yes.
kind of gets the mixture.
Of course, that happens to all churches, among white churches as well, and other institutions,
Mhm.
not just religious institutions. All right. You mentioned something there that I want to ask you about before I forget it, and that is you mentioned a physician. What has medical service, medical care in Waco been like for the black community? Have there been many black physicians? I was just trying to think. Currently, is there a physician's office in East Waco that you know of?
Not at the present, I don't believe. We do have a black doctor that moved in here, maybe to give a little, take a look, about 2 years ago now.
Mhm.
And he has an office just in the shadows of Providence Hospital,
Uh-huh.
and he's doing a good job.
Good.
We lost Dr. Breathwaite, who had office in the middle, sort of in the center of East Waco.
Mhm.
We lost him about 4 years ago, so we've had a lag in there.
Mhm.
Mhm.
As far as you know, then there's only one black physician in Waco. Are there?
At the present, we have, I would say 1.5. One is now studying and sort of working.
All right.
Now, whether he will end up after he completes his studies and his work, he's doing his practice work or field work
Mhm.
at the hospitals now. And he lives in Marlin, so
Right.
he's real.
Right.
Mhm.
Has medical care been a major concern for the black community in Waco, or have they felt that it's been basically all right, or have there been areas that they have felt frustrated?
Well, of course, that's pretty hard for, just for me to. Sometimes if you kind of go out checking on some of these things, you get to know there's some frustrations, I think, that happen among people that you may come in contact with, wondering whether this doctor has done all that he could.
Yes.
And I went to another doctor, and someone said this one's the best, and someone said I shouldn't stay with this one. I ought to try a second one. So I think you have some of this period in a community. I guess some of the black communities have suffered in the smaller cities in terms of what we would say the black doctor, because of the economy is one thing, and then as we used to, kind of coming out of seminary, we used to say some of the boys would rather have up a little shingle in a big city than to have up a big shingle in a little city.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it kind of, so this is what you
Right.
sort of come up against.
All right. Well, let's move back then to the early 60s. We talked a bit last time about your settling in as pastor at Second Baptist Church. Let me ask the question about the developments in the church and its its program during the early 60s, what were the things that were claiming most of your time and attention as pastor? We'll come back to the community at large a little later, but or maybe they're kind of merged together. I don't know.
Yeah, well,
The urban renewal, of course, that
mhm.
was a big thing during that time.
Right.
Anything else?
I can't, let's see, you, sort of during that time you had the civil rights, fight, struggle, and those two things played a part. But getting back to the church, I guess my biggest job was to zero in and try to close up as many gaps as I could in terms of Second Baptist had been moving, so it wasn't a matter of getting it moving, it was a matter of maybe trying to strengthen. It had the general structure: Sunday school, training union, young people's work, choir, and on. So it had the general, according to church life.
Right.
It was just a matter of looking to see where I could strengthen here and strengthen there, bring them another step further in terms. And of course, I guess as pastor, sometimes the black pastor has to stretch out pretty thin because of budget. We don't have an educational director, so he becomes the pastor, the educational director, a little Jonathan here and there.
Yeah.
Because that's casual. I mean, we had enough budget to take care of that. But many times the black pastor in some of the what we call relatively larger churches has to stretch out pretty thin. Not making excuses, so there's just so much you can cover. And this is what I try to live with, lest you get frustrated. So we had the radio program. I preached my trial sermon on the radio KWTX. The church had been on KWTX at 10:30 Sunday morning for 8 years when I got here, and we have continued that program at that same time, so that gives us a little over 30 years on the air.
Do you know whether or not anyone has taped those services, put them on tape or not, or any of them?
Some of I have taped some, I have members. No Red Big job has been done in that term, but from time to time they have been taped. We have a pretty wide listening audience now. Who may have done this, I don't know.
But you mentioned the civil rights movement, and of course that was beginning to get underway during this period. What do you recall as the first kind of movings of that movement in Waco?
It was a kind of combination of events that brought us together. I mean, that started the movement to going. We knew that the school in Waco had not integrated. Almost every other city of size had made some kind of move since the desegregation law had been handed down, what is that, in 54. So here you're looking at from 54 to the early part of 60, nothing had been done. So it was under this period, during this period under my leadership then as president of the, that something would need to be done. We met together and kind of set up a list of things that we would want to do. And one was, I made mention, we went before the school board because no move had been made to desegregate the schools. It appears to me, as I recall now, the school board had made some kind of a motion several years before this to do, and this kind of helped to slow things down as far as a thrust or request. But anyhow, we met with the school board and talked with them in terms of starting the desegregation program going. And of course, in that conversation, we had a good session together, just talking as a group to another group. We discovered that we would have to set up some kind of program in motion to bring about a lawsuit, which would set everything in order. And of course, we did set up the opening of school that year. I think it was 62, if I'm not mistaken, or 63. Something was happening all those years.
Yeah.
But anyhow, we deputized or got organized to send some to each of the schools, and they were turned down. And when they were turned down, then we filed a suit against school desegregation. And of course, there was not a whole lot of court fight to be done. I mean, the law was the law, and the separate but equal could not be justified. And so it's just a matter of procedure in the court to show that this has not been done, and that this is what the law calls for. And so they, after the court's decision for the school board to proceed, they did proceed. We had another, during the same time, we were meeting with the 7-Eleven. We knew we had a 7-Eleven in East Waco, right in the shadow of Paul Quinn, right in the heart of East Waco. And the 7-Eleven Incorporated had no blacks hired anywhere, even hardly as janitors. In East Waco, throughout the Southwest. So we negotiated with the manager of the 7-Elevens, and of course he pretty well shook his head. I think they gave a scholarship to blacks. This is out of the Incorporated Fund, not the East Waco, but out of their incorporation. But this was as much as they were willing to do. A committee of 2 or 3 of us met several times with him. He pretty well shook his head on it. So then we decided to use one of the legal procedures to picket. We studied the picket laws. I think this is one of the things we've tried to let it be known, that we try to follow all the laws. We studied the picket laws, and we discovered we need to keep our pickets 50 feet apart, lest we break a law. Then we wrote a letter to the manager of 7-Eleven of the date that we would set up our picket line. We sent a letter to the police chief informing him of the day how we'd set up our picket line. And of course, we had in the letter, if we need to be reached, my telephone number was in there, and the secretary's telephone number and our address. And we mailed them, and we set up our picket line. Of course, we stayed out there. I think that was the year of 63. We started right at the closing of school, which was in May, and we were out there from June through about the middle of July. Of course, our picket line was getting pretty weak
Yeah.
in the summer.
Yeah.
But we had organizations, churches, and et cetera that would give us, we didn't need but about 3 per picket period. We had individuals who would bring us refreshments across the street, and it was about 90%. Of course, they said we can close it up and forget about it, some of the administration of 7-Eleven, but anyhow, we were there. And they called us in and told us that we were ready to negotiate, and we will set it up the line. No one man was responsible. And naturally, it was a business, and we were going to I think they wanted 2 weeks to partially save face, whatever. We didn't. We'd go along with that. Give us until a certain date, and by this certain date, we'll have a worker in there. And on that date, they had someone in there. Now they're working 7-Elevens all over town. At that same time, we were looking at some others. We were going to the theaters, and they were sort of shaking their heads on opening their doors, but we kept negotiating with them. They opened their doors.
Back to this picket before we leave that, picking of 7-Elevens. Who were the people who mostly were on the picket line? Were they young people for the most part, or?
Really, both and.
Okay. And the pickets were there to encourage residents of East Waco not to
trade
there. What was the response of the black community to that? Did most of them stay away?
Right. We had 95% cooperation. It could even be better than, but 95, I wouldn't be afraid to say 95% cooperation. So it was.
All right, I don't want to stop your story. You're going to talk about the theaters and all,
Yeah,
but
that's all right.
But you started out by saying we. Now, who was the we involved in this planning? Was this NAACP?
Right.
All right.
Was.
NAACP was the structure around which this planning, or through which this kind of planning and negotiation was taking place. All right, well, continue. You talk with the theaters.
Right, the theater managers and what have you, and they eventually did. I mean, no protests were set up. Our procedure is to start out just as an organization group asking for these things, and we try to work it out the best way we can without moving into some of the other legal steps.
Were you usually individually involved in these negotiations? That is, you as president would usually be there and negotiating with them. Who were some other people providing leadership in the NAACP in Waco during this time?
We had Arthur Joe. Arthur Joe, who worked at the post office. He was secretary. We had Haywood Weaver that would serve from time to time on the committee. He worked at the post office. Of course, we had some of the pastors. Sometimes they were out. I think Reverend Hardy was to be with us when we went to the school board, but he was out. I believe Reverend Griffin would have been with us. We tried to, because they were all committed and members. But he was in Israel. It could have been, I'm not positive whether Reverend McClooney was with us at that time or not. But anyhow, these individuals. And of course then we had laymen from that may not have given the leadership, because that's the main question you were
Mhm.
asking. Well, these were kind of your.
All right. What about the restaurants? Did you ever?
All right. Yes. Now the restaurants. We had a Piccadilly downtown, and our youth really got in that move to protest, and they went down and tried to get in and were not permitted.
Were not served. That
Were
is,
not
they
served,
wanted to be
right.
served food.
And they started a protest. I may just back up a little bit on this restaurant, because we were working with all of these areas at that time. The restaurants, we'd ask that they be integrated. The restaurants, by and large, had okayed opening up, but Piccadilly was standing in the way, wouldn't open up. So the other restaurant owner said, "Look, we're ready to open our doors, but we don't want to open our doors and lose all of our white trade to one who has his doors closed to black trade, because some of our folks were leaving." And we could understand this. So then we knew that was
The one you had
the
to get.
stumbling block.
Yeah.
And
Was the resistance there from local management?
no, it
or-
wasn't. I'm thinking to
Okay.
mention this. Actually, and of course we had another individual, I could call his name, but I'd rather not, in our city here, who had called to New Orleans. In fact, he talked with me about the situation. I said, yes, it's a protest, picket going on down there. It was kind of demonstration. And I told him, I said, it's going to increase. They picked up a Latin American, a white yesterday, and they're going to pick up some more today. And so he said, well, I'm going to see what we can do, and because this is one of the white citizens, kind of front runners in Waco. He called to New Orleans, and of course he called me back. He said, I'll be getting in touch with you. He said, it's sad when a man can sit off in another state and dictate what's to happen for the better, for the worse in your city. So it's in when I discovered. So the manager was not at fault here. And so he came out one day, we talked together. And the next day, I guess wheels got to move in some kind of way. The next day he came out to the parsonage there, and he got out of the car smiling. He said, if any kids come there today, they better have money, because I'm going to feed everyone.
He was ready to do
Yes,
business.
sir. He said, they better have money, because I'm going to feed everyone. And of course, this opened up the restaurants. Then, I think it's unique, because this has been, I think, one of the layman's in the loaf in Waco. It was kind of during that time, and you have others who want to lead out, and they don't follow proper procedures. Some of the maybe leadership that sort of coveted what was happening by way of our leadership started a wildcat boycott on pure milk. And we were trying to break into whatever areas we could. And it wasn't organized. It was just a wildcat. They were telling this, passing the word along. Well, we didn't do it. We don't do it that way. I mean, we deal from the top and then work on down, or work on up, whatever.
Yeah.
So they were passing the word along in East Waco, don't buy any pure milk, and some slurs were kind of passed on to the drivers of the trucks. And so the chamber, this got back to the chamber, and it was getting to us, I guess.
The Waco Chamber of Commerce.
Waco Chamber of Commerce. And so they got together and said, now this is, and I think they were kind of some slurs that some of the other drivers of maybe soda water trucks. Well, all of them were white.
Mm-hmm.
Pure milk drivers all white. Pure milk drivers. Soda water bread drivers and all. And so the Waco Chamber of Commerce called the leadership, preachers, pastors, and other laymen who had some voice together for a meeting. They said, now look, we're in the knowledge of maybe some of these things that are unpleasant that are going on. And these were these slurs against these white drivers coming into East Waco mainly.
Mm-hmm.
And of course we let them know that they would work with us. And hope we would work with them. And they said, we're not going to promise you everything, but if you would do this, call your people together and just make a listing of all the things that you would want and get that list back to us, and we'll stay in touch through the leadership, and we will try to go through as many of these doors as we can for the betterment of the whole community. And I thought this was because many other cities at this time were in kind of upheavals and frustrations and bickering, and so this was a most unique move. People's emotions were high.
Yeah.
And this kind of helped to simmer it down, and then we began to. And this kind of happened in the. Well, our picketing really kind of, I think, triggered in a type of way. Some were telling H-E-B and Safeway they began to open up and put some clerks in.
Mm-hmm.
H-E-B and Safeway were both down Elm Street.
Mm-hmm.
Because some of the folk that love to keep things going, they're going to come down here when they get through up there, you know. But all of that.
Well, this Wildcat event, did that reflect any significant sentiment among blacks that maybe things weren't moving fast enough to suit them?
No, I guess no. Actually, what you have, and as we evaluate and analyze it, you always have, I guess, with anything, those who covet.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe they think it's popularity. Some of it, I wish they would, take it off me if I was in it for that. I would have given up a long time ago. But they covet the leadership and maybe what glory, some glory goes with, maybe some accomplishments and some victories. But we're not in it for that. We're in it because we think that this is right.
Mm-hmm.
And we have to live with ourselves and our convictions. And this has been my only commitment to it.
Mm-hmm.
Something in me that leads me to just stand up for what I think is right when I can stand up in the way that I can stand up.
Mm-hmm.
And I sleep peacefully at night. I've got to live with me.
Mm-hmm.
But so there are those individuals who covet, and they have some followership and they want to lead out, but they don't want to follow the proper procedures. Because we were called in on this Wildcat Boys boycott after it didn't move fast enough.
Mm-hmm.
And we were called in to pull the chestnuts out of the fire to make them look better than they were looking.
Mm-hmm.
And because, well, people follow certain names, certain images.
Yeah.
If we represent their image, they follow us. Another name could be called, and they go about their business. They've heard what they want to hear.
during this time, the whole civil rights struggle, were there any in the white community that you recall who played any significant role in helping in the civil rights cause in Waco?
There were some individuals, in fact, I guess the leadership of the Chamber of Commerce, Waco, Chamber of Commerce, Waco, I forget now, some of them I knew and some that I didn't know. Maybe I'd just like to call all the names if I'd rather call all the names. There were some who were sort of leaders in the background, and of course we could understand this, as even the restaurant owners said that if they failed, we'll lose. So they stayed in the background, and in that they did, they were very vital. But in that they did, I'd rather not call their names as such. Mm-hmm. But we did have some whites in the community with influence.
Was there ever any a black Muslim element in Waco that you were aware of? Especially among the young people, that's usually where it developed in other parts of the United States.
If I think you always have some little inklings, but Waco, being the size, does not lend itself. We had some little uprising, but nothing that I really became alarmed at. Because Waco is not of that size, and which does not give them enough ratio of followership. Houston, you've got hundreds and maybe you could even say thousands of individuals who are there without hope and haven't given too much thought about hope for tomorrow, so they'll follow anything. But here in Waco, the community is small enough to sort of keep them from getting too much of a hold to become any threat.
All right, one other thing. As the civil rights movement developed during the mid and then toward the late 60s, there developed what has come to be called the Black Power movement. Black is beautiful. Emphasis upon black consciousness. How did that, if that did happen in Waco, and I assume that it did to some extent, how did that take shape here, and how did it influence, have impact upon what you were doing and those about you were doing?
I don't think that really had too much of an impact in Waco. I mean, you get a shade of this maybe all across the nation in black community, but I think you had enough leadership across the community which kept this kind of thing from getting out of hand. People pick up certain expression, black is beautiful, black power, but here again you didn't have enough population here, and then with that you had to have a kind of leadership that could spark. So you had the Muslim paper that was being sold on the streets. Well, now they were out on the streets, and soon they were gone. And you had one little paper that got it started here just a couple of years ago. You may have seen some of the copies, Grassroots, but it's gone
Yeah.
because they were they were using the paper to pick on the ones who were given leadership.
I'm not familiar with this. I never saw this little paper. Is this?
Yeah, I didn't know whether it could have floated around.
No.
Actually, one of the boys could have gone to Baylor.
Hmm.
Was editor.
And they were essentially being critical of leadership in the
Leadership.
community.
Positive leadership. But it soon died.
Yeah.
So that the Black Power movement never a real threat here in Waco.
All right, let me ask you about an aspect of all this that's really not Black Power, I guess, but more the Black is beautiful notion. That is that the movement from a time when blacks, well, first of all, they generally did not call themselves blacks, you know.
Right, right.
But later did come to use that term and to use it with pride.
Mm-hmm.
A time when originally I can remember some black students in the early 60s being kind of embarrassed about their past and about the way they talked, and they worked hard on getting their hair straight, you know, and it was almost as if, you know, they were moving toward, you know, being as white as they could, in a sense. All right, now from that to the late 60s, when black students were talking about how good chitlins were, you know, and soul food restaurant opens up, you know, in East Waco, and blacks begin to talk about the pride they had in their heritage and that sort of thing. Now, describe how you saw that happen and the degree to which it has happened, and evaluate it. What do you think its significance is?
I think, following, you know, the question that you're raising, to me, and when I say me, I interpret it in the light of how I see it, but I don't think I stand alone in this. Those who were mixed in, there was some of these things are spin-offs of what has taken place. We were pushing for first-class citizenship. Okay, when you push for first-class citizenship, you are saying you want these things. We won't end. Someone maybe put it in words. We want everything up to that, all the way, even including their codes.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So, okay. Well, with that, we had a culture, and we have a culture. So some of us were saying that, and it was said and understood that as we come in, we're coming in with a culture. Chitlins and hot bones, this has been our culture. And we have something to offer them, and they have something to offer us. We don't have to give up what we have. They don't have to give up but we can share the the illustration was given how, and I think this says in a little way, they were saying that some of our men had been working with whites, and they would kind of lunch together in the mess hall. And this story was told, but I think it says what, and it was saying that the blacks would pray at that lunch period, and the whites started praying at that lunch period. So here was a sharing, coming together of some custom, the custom of prayer. Now, it's not saying that whites don't pray at lunch, but it says to us that there's a sharing. So I think some of this was a spin-off of this fight, this thrust, and some of the things that come in the aftermath. So many who were saying black is beautiful, well, there's a statement, and many of us said it. Beauty is as beauty does.
Mm-hmm.
And some of us use the other expression, black can be beautiful. But it's how the beauty is in what beauty does. So all of these are, as I said, sort of spin-offs
Right.
of
Do you often or ever, and did you during this period ever deal with these kinds of issues as a preacher that is in the pulpit?
some of the things I've said, just said, I've used them from the pulpit.
Right.
And even the black power, many of us said, you got a fist rolled up, ain't nothing in it. You know?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
How do you-
and I'm not the only one. I mean, this
Right.
is kind of a general, to offset, to put people, this puts them to thinking and puts them looking at some certain goals, but at the same time, leadership across. The church still, and the black preachers still, to some degree, to a large degree, one of the predominant forces and influences in the black community.
Well, we've been at it about an hour and a half
Yeah.
again today, and I
Yeah.
guess it's time for us to bring this to a conclusion.
Mm.
Again, let me thank you for your time, and we'll look forward to picking up this story and finishing it one of these days.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you so
Mighty
much.
good. Thank you. Enjoyed being here.